The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a military disaster, it was a psychological one. For the CIA, it was a gut punch. For the Pentagon, a humiliation. And for the Kennedy administration, a PR nightmare. What most Americans didn't realize was that President John F. Kennedy had only been in office for 3 months when the invasion began. He hadn't created the plan, he had inherited it. A cockamamie CIA scheme hatched under the Eisenhower administration that was already in motion by the time he took the oath of office. The invasion had been sold as airtight, but in reality, it was underfunded, poorly coordinated, and based on wildly optimistic assumptions about the Cuban people rising up against Castro. They didn't. The world watched as America's covert operation fell apart in real time. Castro paraded prisoners in front of cameras. Khrushchev mocked U.S. weakness. And inside Washington, patience wore thin. And once given the green light, the failure landed squarely on Kennedy's shoulders. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's top military leaders, began pushing for something far more aggressive. They didn't want another half-baked mission. They wanted a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But there was a problem. The American people weren't interested in another war. Not after Korea, not after the Bay of Pigs. And without public outrage, there could be no political mandate for military action. That's when a new idea emerged. Not one based on intelligence or diplomacy, but on manipulation. If they couldn't win the hearts and minds honestly, they'd manufacture the crisis themselves. And in March of 1962, the U.S. Department of Defense submitted a proposal that would send shockwaves through history, though the public wouldn't learn about it for another 35 years. The proposal was called Operation Northwoods. And it came directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's highest-ranking military brass. And it wasn't just one bad idea, it was a checklist of chaos. The plan outlined a series of false flag operations, attacks that would appear to be carried out by Cuba, but were actually staged by the U.S. government. The goal? Create a public justification for a full-scale military invasion. Some of the suggestions read like scenes from a dystopian screenplay. They included fake hijackings of commercial airlines blamed on Cuban agents, bombings in Miami, Washington, and even inside U.S. military installations. A drone airliner painted to match a real passenger flight would be remotely destroyed over Cuban waters. A list of fake victims, complete with staged funerals, would be published to sell the illusion. They even considered sinking a U.S. Navy ship and faking Cuban sabotage, or staging a deadly riot among Cuban exiles in Florida, supposedly incited by Castro's agents. The memo even referenced history itself, suggesting a new Remember the Maine incident, a nod to 1898 when the mysterious explosion of a U.S. warship triggered war with Spain. They wanted to follow the same blueprint, manufacture a tragedy, blame the enemy, and rally the nation. One memo proposed assassinating Cuban refugees or American civilians to generate a helpful wave of indignation across the country. These weren't theoretical suggestions buried in the footnotes. They were written in plain language, deliberate, cold, methodical. And most disturbing of all, the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't just brainstorm the plan, they signed off on it. The document was approved by General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and delivered to the Secretary of Defense in March of 1962. The final decision now rested with one man, the President of the United States. The Northwoods proposal was submitted to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and from there it made its way to the President. John F. Kennedy was just over a year into his first term, still weathering the blowback from the Bay of Pigs, still battling his own military leadership behind closed doors. But this time, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had gone too far. Operation Northwoods wasn't a military plan. It was a blueprint for domestic terrorism. The document was signed and endorsed by the most powerful generals in America. General Lyman Lemnitzer, General Curtis LeMay, General George H. Decker, Admiral George W. Anderson Jr., and General David M. Shute. General Lyman Lemnitzer wasn't some loose cannon. He was a decorated World War II veteran, key architect of Cold War defense strategy, and the most powerful military officer in the United States, which made his approval of Northwoods all the more chilling. These weren't fringe actors. These were the Pentagon's top brass. And President Kennedy, he rejected it. No edits, no debate, no discussion. He shut the whole thing down. Lemnitzer was quietly pushed out months later, reassigned to a NATO command. And Northwoods was buried, locked away in the classified vaults of the Pentagon, where it remained hidden for over 35 years. Operation Northwoods was never carried out, but its existence tells us something critical, not just about the Cold War, but about power. In 1962, the top military minds of America proposed terror attacks on its own people. And they did it so confidently because they believed the ends justify the means. That alone should have sparked a national scandal, but it didn't. Northwoods remained buried until 1997, when it was uncovered through a sweep of documents released by the JFK Assassination Records Review Board. The plan sat untouched in the Pentagon archives for decades, until a handful of researchers started asking the right questions. And by then, all of the architects were gone. And the Cold War they hoped to escalate was long over. For historians, it became a case study in how far democracy can drift behind closed doors. For others, it raised darker questions. Why would a government even consider something like this? What else might have been proposed and buried? Operation Northwoods wasn't some isolated idea. Elements inside the U.S. government had long considered psychological warfare and staged provocations. From World War II deception operations to Cold War contingency planning, the logic was always the same. If public opinion won't go where you want it, give it a push. But most of all, what would have happened if Kennedy had said yes? In the months after he rejected Northwoods, his relationship with the Joint Chiefs deteriorated. He grew increasingly skeptical of the CIA, the Pentagon, and even his own advisors. He publicly stated he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. And then, on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Officially, there's no connection. But unofficially, Operation Northwoods remains one of the most compelling exhibits in the long, dark shadow of the JFK conspiracy theories. Because once you learn that America's own generals drafted a plan to kill Americans for political gain, suddenly the unthinkable doesn't seem so far-fetched. Let us know your thoughts about Operation Northwoods in the comment sections below.
Now I know why the Pentagon is one of the most secured places in America. There's more cameras and they protect that place, and I think I know why now. If you remember, one of the plans was to hijack planes. Do you remember the Twin Towers? And it took us to war. Same story, different year. Odd, isn't it? So, do you really trust your government? Subscribe. Hit the like button. Yeah.